Hello there, historians. I'm Jeff Beckstrom, and today I have a lesson for you on the foundations of the Cold War, both ideological foundations and the early action of the Cold War, as well as the spread of communism in China. Uh, so, this lesson is designed to be used with this Google Documents note taker. So, please open this note taker at the same time as you are viewing this screencast. So, on to the slides. So quickly, if you want to remember, before the start of World War II, there's three main competing ideologies. You can pause the video for a moment if you'd like to try to recall and answer these questions on your own. The three ideologies were democracy, fascism, and communism, or competing forms of government, if you will. And you might also remember that the democracies were kind of counting on the fascists and the communists to fight each other. It's not the way that World War II played out. Anyhow, the democracies and the communists ended up teaming up to defeat the fascists. So after World War II, it was left for democracy and communism to square off for the rest of the 1900s, pretty much. We need to go back before World War II, though, to get to the beginning of the issue. And really, capitalism and communism have been at odds since the creation of communism and the rise of the Industrial Revolution and all of that. Really, communism was an anti-capitalist form of government and economic system. So they never could have mixed. Just to run that down for you briefly, the main point here, the main headline is that in capitalism, individuals have to own things and make decisions about the things that they own that are best for themselves. And in communism, the government owns everything, and the government decides what to do with all of everything. So you cannot have both those two things in the same place at the same time. Combine that with the fact that the communists had a goal of worldwide communist revolution, and you'll get some concerned democracies. Post-World War I, when Russia lost about a quarter of its farmland in the treaty that they signed with Germany to exit World War I, you can see a map of that here, actually. A whole slew of countries on the map on the right created out of territory that once was part of the Russian Empire. Germany is a bit smaller. You can see all those post-World War I, Treaty of Versailles, newly created countries. So the Russians were pretty upset about that. They thought that maybe with the defeat of Germany that they'd get to have that territory back, but the idea of self-determination carried the day at the Treaty of Versailles. And then during the Russian Civil War, where there was still some question as to who was going to control the country of Russia, the Communist Red Army was fighting against the White Army, and the White Army was aided by democracies. So the democracies didn't go all in. England, the United States, they didn't go all in on trying to stop the communists from taking over Russia, but they were there, and they were ostensibly fighting on behalf of the Russian White Army. So once the communists won, they put that one in their back pocket as one reason to distrust the democracies in the West, because the democracies had tried to kill communist baby in its cradle. And then during World War II, there was a few things that the democracies and the communists disagreed about. Chief among them is the fact that Stalin allied himself with Hitler early on, and then when Hitler invaded the USSR, there was heavy Russian losses. Stalin really wanted the democracies to invade Western Europe and siphon off some of those German forces invading Russia, but they held off on it, hoping that the fascists and the communists would bleed themselves out for a long enough period of time. The USSR wanted to replace fascism. The USSR wanted communism to replace fascism, and the West obviously wanted democracies to replace fascism. And so that set up the kind of, who's going to control Germany, East Germany, West Germany part that we see during the Cold War. So on to the ideological foundations of the Cold War. The last piece here for answering that first question, if you're following along the note taker, is the idea of the domino theory. You can see the illustration above. The Viet Cong is the name of pro-communist fighters sponsored by China and the USSR in Vietnam, who were trying to turn the entire country of Vietnam to communist. They were based in the north of Vietnam, and the United States is trying to prop up a pseudo-democratic regime in the south of Vietnam. You'll hear more about the Vietnam War later. But the idea here is that if one country goes to communism, like China had previously gone to communism, which we'll talk about in a moment, before the Vietnam War, and then their neighbor, and then their neighbor, and then their neighbor, and then their neighbor. So the idea motivating the United States foreign policy was that we have to stop it before it starts to spread, before the dominoes start to fall. So here's an interesting illustration of what's called the Truman Doctrine. So right immediately after World War II, the Truman Doctrine was created, so named for the President of the United States, Harry Truman. It was motivated by the domino theory, and the first opportunity to test the idea of the Truman Doctrine that the United States would actively intervene to stop communism was in Greece, where you can see the picture of a Greek soldier standing in defiance of the communist Russian bear kind of looming over him in the background. That was successful for the part of the democracies. Greece did not turn communist at that time. And then by 1949, we see the Cold War actually getting cold. The USSR successfully tests its first nuclear weapon in the year 1949. This created a situation in which both the United States and the USSR were not really wanting to go to war, because a direct conflict could mean the end of all life on Earth, nuclear fallout all around the globe, radioactivity, only cockroaches left, all that kind of stuff. They were reluctant to attack each other directly. So for most of the Cold War, what we see is a war of words, a war of spies, a war of the Olympics, and then actual wars being fought in other locations, so-called proxy wars. These so-called proxy wars saw either the United States or the USSR intervening in conflicts around the world, and they happened almost everywhere, all throughout Asia, all throughout Latin America, all throughout Africa and South Asia. Just to name a few down there: Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, the Congo, Afghanistan, and the list goes on. A lot of those regions are still, a lot of those countries are still unstable, and a lot of that has to do with the way that they were pawns in the Cold War. So you can take a moment to answer. Make sure you've answered those first 3 questions. And now we'll talk a little bit about China. So China had something that you can call a nationalist government. It's a pretty generic term to say a nationalist government, a pro-China Chinese government. Seems obvious. Anyhow, the so-called nationalist government in the early 1900s and before was fairly corrupt and ineffective at fighting the Japanese. In fact, the leader of the nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek, was receiving all kinds of help from the Americans in World War II to fight against the Japanese, but they were still unable to really do so effectively. And then on the other side of the coin, in China, the communists, who had been nearly eradicated before the start of World War II by those nationalist government forces, were able to find some effectiveness to hide out in the northern parts of China, in the countryside, and build up a strong following by actually being effective at repelling the Japanese. Though had the Japanese wanted to go full force into the rural regions of China, they probably would have been able to do so. So what this enabled is the rise of this man, Mao Zedong. He became the communist leader. His playbook was pretty familiar for communists, stoking hatred of the wealthy and creating a really infamous cult of personality. Chairman Mao, as he was known, is probably, right up there with Hitler and Stalin as historical figures who have created for themselves and benefited from the most greatly a cult of personality. Remember, a cult of personality is making oneself into a godlike figure, kind of replacing God with yourself. There's a famous painting of Napoleon crowning himself Emperor of Europe. This is kind of like an early version of cult of personality. And of course, in the 20th century, with the evolution of media and such, tools available to dictatorships to create these cults of personality became much more sophisticated. So communism's impact in China was, fairly disastrous, especially at the hands of a guy like Mao. What we see here is that while the United States was willing to intervene in Europe with the Truman Doctrine in Greece, they were unwilling to intervene in Asia with the potential for a much larger country of China to become communist. I would attribute this to American racism and also to the fact that China wasn't terribly industrialized. It was seen as backwards by Western countries. So, well, hey, what do they have to contribute to the global economy besides 650 million people living there at the time? Anyhow, so the United States did not intervene. And then what the communists did, Mao specifically, once he was in power in China, became a really, really strong argument for future intervention or for future military adventures to try to stop communism and supporting other dictatorships to be anti-communist and so on and so forth. Some of those things were killing of landlords and redistributing land to the peasants. Seems like it could be done without killing the people that owned the land previously, but what do I know? And then most specifically, what I want you to reference in your answers, if you're following along in the note taker, are two things. One is the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was a ridiculous plan to build Chinese industry. The idea was that the Chinese needed lots of steel as a building material. Also, steel was a valuable export commodities that they could use to trade for other things to build up their industry. So all of the peasants and such were supposed to make backyard furnaces. Many of those backyard furnaces injured people. People melted down their tools in order to try to make steel, to fill steel making quotas. This resulted in famine because when farmers melt down their tools, they don't have the tools that they need to make food for people to eat. As it says there, a ridiculous plan for industrialization that backfired, causing mass starvation. And then there's something called the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, as I move my head out of the way, was an anti-intellectual movement that massacred educated Chinese, sending educated Chinese people like, oh, all of you educated people, you go to the farms and work. And they went to the farms and worked and also got killed. Something very similar would actually happen around this same time and a little bit later in the country of Cambodia under the dictatorship of Pol Pot. Anyhow, this was a huge blow to Chinese industry and the building of Chinese industry and Chinese human capital, murdering all of the people who had taken the time in their lives to become educated and had that opportunity. So this was set China back. It was already considered backwards, and it did set China back. China is now an economic powerhouse for the global economy and center of manufacturing for most of the world. But it could have been so even earlier had it not been for the disastrous policies and leadership of the Chinese communists, Mao chief among them, but others as they followed. That's it for today's lesson. If you're following along the note taker, please make sure you've answered all of those questions before submitting. Thanks. Bye-bye.